There was no material necessity for European society to abandon the ideas of freedom. It was a failure of the liberals at the time to meet the challenges posed by their competitors that doomed so much of humanity to the violence, oppression, brutality, poverty, and suffering inflicted on them in the name of the nation, the state, the race, the universal class, or the other false gods to which flesh and blood humans were sacrificed. Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we'll be having a discussion with Tom Palmer. Please check out his excellent book, Realizing Freedom. Tom, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Keith.
You have an excellent article that I came across on Reason, and it's called The Terrifying Rise of Authoritarian Populism. Envy and resentment are driving collectivist impulses around the world. So I want to make sure we're on the same page with the terms here. What is the difference between collectivism and individualism?
Well, it's goes down to a very deep moral level. It has a question of what is the moral agent involved? Is it the individual or something, the nation, the state, the race, the people, whatever it might happen to be? It's a question of misplaced concreteness. Collectivists tend to see on a methodological level, they see it as the group that's doing the acting and the choosing. And they posit that the group is an individual like you or me with values and anger and emotions and so on. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. The group, if you will, is an abstract entity. It's made up of all the individuals in it and their complex relationships with them. But it does not follow that the group is an individual like you are or I am. Similarly, we can talk about forests. There's nothing crazy about saying, look, there's a forest. We don't have to say just tree, 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 tree. There is a forest, but it's made up of the trees and all of their relationships with them. There's canopy trees and smaller trees and so on. That's what ecologists talk about when they talk about ecosystems. It doesn't follow that a forest should be understood in the same way that a tree is. This is a fundamental error that people make frequently, which is to look at the nation or the group or the country or whatever as an individual and then to posit the kinds of characteristics we associate with individuals, such as having a scale of values. In fact, we should think of a society or a nation or a group as a collection of individual human beings and their very complex relationships among themselves. But it's an error to posit the same kind of concreteness to the group that we posit to the individual. And then finally, on a moral level, it's very easy then when they think of the individual when they think of the group, the nation or what have you, as an individual, they think of you and me, the constituent elements, as we would think about our hair. Well, I'm going to cut my hair, right? Nothing is really lost. My hair doesn't have any rights. If I trim my nails, there's no loss of rights. But now they want to think of individual human beings like the human being thinks of his or her hair or nails. You cut it, there's nothing lost. And that is a fundamental moral mistake because every human being matters. Every individual has moral significance. Every life is precious. Whereas for the collectivists, these are things that are just to be sacrificed for the good of the collective being.
So when Vladimir Putin says there's a big difference between the Russian mindset and the American mindset, the American cares is about the individual. In Russia, we care about the collective. It sounds on its face like Americans care about one person themselves and Russians care about many people as far as, he's portraying it. So is the difference, when you see a group of 10 million people, the collectivist sees one entity, the individualist sees 10 million individuals potentially cooperating, each with their own values and ideas?
Well, more or less, but let's go back to what many people argue. They say, oh, America is somehow individualist in a way that our country isn't. So somehow you're imposing your values on us if you recognize the moral significance of each and every person. But in fact, if you go to Russia, and I've been there many times, you find that people there don't really like being tortured. They don't really like being oppressed or beaten by the police. They're individuals in the same way that someone in Connecticut or Canada is as well. There's not a difference in that regard. But this is what is always said by those who hold power. They say, don't worry, we don't think that way. And so when we brutalize religious minorities, when in Germany and in Europe, when Jews were exterminated, they say, who are you to criticize us? As if those people who were being sacrificed and brutalized had somehow agreed to it or welcomed it or wanted it. And that is simply factually wrong. It can be, of course, the case that there are widespread political attitudes that may differ from one country to another. That's not surprising. Groups of people differ in lots of regards. But it doesn't follow that somehow that means that the life of an individual Russian is of less significance, is less important than the life of an individual person in the United States or Canada or some other country. That is a mistake. Putin wants to go from, yes, Russian culture is different in many ways from American culture, which is, obvious and clear. He wants to go from that to individual Russians don't matter. And when I kill them, nothing is lost. And that, in fact, is a completely invalid inference from the existence of different attitudes about politics and so on, which, of course, do differ from place to place.
It is almost like they see the society as one human and the actual people as cells within the body. So if you have
And the ones who say that always see themselves as the brain. None of them ever see themselves as the fingernail.
Yeah, exactly. So if, they kill off a few people or a lot of people, you're just killing off cancerous cells to the body. You can see that. So in your article, The Terrifying Rise of Authoritarian Populism, what is populism and how does it differentiate from popular democracy?
Oh, that's a very good and important question. So populism isn't just about wanting to be popular. Of course, all politicians want to be popular. Most human beings like being popular to one degree or another. There are, of course, introverts and people who are not interested in that, but it's unusual. Populism is completely different. It's an ideology that identifies one movement or one party with the populace, that is to say, with the people. So it starts with the idea that there's a true or authentic nation or people who are being somehow persecuted or harmed by some other group. An elite, they might be the 1%, might be one way to describe them, or the Jews, or minorities, or whatever it might happen to be, that they're the enemy of the people. So first off, the argument that there's an authentic, true people, and then the enemies of the people. This has been expressed casually so many different ways. A populist figure in Britain who was a leader of the Brexit campaign, Nigel Farage, put it very clearly. By the way, this is separate from the question whether Brexit was a good or a bad idea. In my view, there were arguments on both sides of that. But he said this will be a victory for real people, which is to say that part of the British population which voted against it, which is close to half, didn't just lose, they weren't real people to begin with. And Donald Trump casually blurted out his views. He said in 2016, the only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything. So there's the people and the other people. So that's a very common element. You articulate within a population an internal frontier between the real people and the unpeople, the enemy of the people. They're inherently anti-pluralist. They see society as having one unity and one will, and that naturally, over time, sometimes very short period of time, translates into one leader. And the one leader is the voice of the people. And we've heard that in America as well. I am your voice. I alone can do it. And so these are expressions of authoritarian populism. A libertarian perspective, in contrast, sees society as complex, as variegated. There's a multitude of different interests in society. And sometimes they coincide or are parallel, and sometimes They are not. There are a multitude of different ways of living and religions, and one can go down the way. Society is complex. It doesn't have one will articulated by one leader. And finally, populism is an ideology that is a tool to power. There's a particularly unreadable and terrible book by Ernesto Laclau called On Populist Reason. If you ever want to punish yourself, go read that book. Like most political theoreticians of this sort, he's a post-Marxist. It's turgid and full of nonsense. But what he articulates very clearly is the idea that the friend-enemy distinction is fundamental to politics. And he says we articulate an internal frontier, distinguishing the true people from the enemies of the people. And you designate the unity of the people by designating who is the enemy. And that is a political decision made by the populist political leader. He has, again, a very opaque language. He says that the leader, the fascist leader, just to be frank about it, is the empty signifier, can have any value put into it. And so who is the enemy can shift depending on, as they say, the kind of people that you want to construct. That has left-wing variants and right-wing variants. Laclau was a post-Marxist, far leftist. His wife, Chantal Mouffe, who's a professor of political thought at University of Westminster in the United Kingdom, in her book on left populism and in various other documents, says, we will construct the people we want to construct. And we do that by designating who is the enemy. And that is very common for populist movements, whether they're on the right wing or the left wing. And the last point, the way people talk about right and left, they suggest that these are opposing ideas in some sense. I think that they're competing ideas, but at base, they're the same idea. It's the idea of collectivism. And they just have different definitions of who the enemy is, and therefore who the true people are. But the fundamental principles of far right and far left are basically the same. They're founded in collectivism and a rejection of the moral significance of the individual human being.
I definitely see that same thing. It's like the collectivist right wants to initiate violence against people under the guise of the well-being of the nation. The left wants to initiate violence under the guise of the well-being of the downtrodden. It's like we don't really see a principled difference between these two. I think calling them competing ideas is much more accurate than opposing ones. Do you think that populism is inherently something that libertarians should stay away from? I know that Murray Rothbard had said that he actually advocates populism as a strategy for libertarians, saying, look at the oppressive state. Waco, Vietnam, all this nonsense. You can't even build something on your own property without, regulators coming in and stopping you. Do you think there's any positive to populism that maybe libertarians can embrace?
In a word, no. And there's a reason for that. And that is that the mentality of positing enemies who have to be destroyed leads to violence and coercion, and ultimately more statism and even dictatorship. So the reason why I disagree here, and it has to do with personal experience also. I knew Murray Rothbard many years ago, and he was influential in my life when I was a young man. And I realized that his theory of social change was based on the Russian Revolution. He grew up in a communist milieu. It was not uncommon for people of his generation and his background that many of his family members and the circle he was in were active communists. He rejected that, but he didn't reject their theory of social change, which was focused on the Soviet seizure of power in Russia. And to a little bit of my shame, when I was very young, I wrote things for his magazine on Lenin and Leninism. He would say, go read this and recapitulate it. He took Lenin as the model of how you would achieve the social change he wanted. But Lenin built a monstrous, murderous dictatorship. That should be a clue. Maybe this isn't the direction you go to create a free society. The idea was to have a cadre of people who would all follow the same party line. He called it the KL, the correct line, was shorthand for that. And they would then lead a wider movement. And as a consequence, he shifted over his years from far left to far right and back and forth and back and forth. He wanted to support the Black Panthers. He wanted to support the right. He went through a kind of brief, what I would call a libertarian period in his life. But he was always gyrating back and forth. And when he died, he supported one of the most unlibertarian political figures in America, which is Pat Buchanan, and sort of far right populistic views, and died. So his slavish followers saw that as the final revelation of their prophet. If you have a movement organized in the way that the Bolsheviks were, you have a movement that is designed to seize the power of the state and then use it to massacre your enemies, which is what Lenin did. That is not what a libertarian wants. We want people to be free from that kind of violence and brutality and domination. And as a consequence, that entire model is useless. There's another element that comes in, and Ernesto Laclau has articulated this, has other populist writers, what Laclau calls the affective dimension of politics. Affective meaning the emotional, the ones that move you. And all of the affective elements that they identify are hatred, rage, resentment. And these emotional affects are, in my opinion, incompatible with the achievement of freedom. We should want to have a society in which, yes, we're angry about injustices when we see it happen. We're angry. But we don't want to be angry people lusting for revenge. So Rothbard even articulated this years ago. He would say, here's the fundamental question. Do you love the oppressed or do you hate the oppressors? I say fuck the oppressed because they deserve it for having put up with it. We should hate the oppressors. So his motivating force was hatred. And hatred finally will not lead you to a free society. I think that is a psychological insight. You can't put it particularly in economic terms, but historically, we have seen movements guided by hate are generally productive of violence, domination, and the elimination of freedom. We should want to love the freedom of other people. So Liu Xiaobo, the great Chinese dissident, the Nobel laureate who was killed in prison, the second Nobel Prize winner to die in prison, the first in the Third Reich, the second in the Xi Jinping's People's Republic of China. And in his last words, his testament, he said, I have no enemies because enemy mentality poisons a free society. And we should strive not to have enemies, but instead to make friends for liberty. That's my summation of what I've learned in the course of my life, personally, and then also through the study of psychology and social and political change.
I would definitely agree with that. I did go through a time in my life where I was very bitter, sort of being first introduced to libertarianism, where it's like, screw everyone on the right because they support war and caging people for drug offenses, and screw everyone on the left who wants to shut down my business because I don't comply with the mass murdering government regulations. It's like, okay, so it's me and 0.1% of people who are libertarian voluntarists. And it is so hating. And I think it's important to realize that it's not that the average person, let's just take the members of my family at Thanksgiving, it's not that they're all evil conspiring against me. They are unfortunately tricked by populism, by hatred of others, by the belief in statism, or the idea that some people have the right to make laws and others have the duty to obey. Do you have any tips on how to communicate to someone who is very deep into the hatred, whether they're the left hating everyone on the right or someone on the right hating everyone because they're pawns of the deep state? Any communication tips you have?
Well, one thing that I generally recommend is to try to keep politics away from the dinner table at family dinners. So whether you're meeting for uh, family dinner of some sort, usually religion and politics are topics that are best left off the table because we want to live with our families and we want to be happy with them. So that's one small word of advice to other people. But then there's another point, which is you're much better off when you can articulate your views and people want to come and ask what you think about something rather than feeling that you're constantly contradicting them and attacking them. No one likes that. Nobody likes to be constantly corrected about something. And I have to admit that one of my personal weaknesses is when I hear someone say something I think is wrong, I feel an impulse to go and correct that. But I learned some time ago you can't do that. As we're sitting here today, around the world, billions of people are saying things that are silly or absurd or erroneous. I'm not obligated to leap out my window and go find them and correct them all the time. People who do that are irritating, and other people, unsurprisingly, don't like that. Much better if you articulate your views in a positive way and do so in a respectful manner to others. And then you'll find other people saying, well, what do you think about that? And you can share it without starting as an attack on that other person. We've also learned something quite remarkable. Brain scans of people, and I've read quite a few books of psychology in the last few years, show that when someone's ideas are being criticized or attacked, the same portions of the brain light up when they feel that they are under physical attack. Because we identify our ideas and our values with ourselves, and someone attacks them, they're attacking me. We should understand that, and instead of attacking people, so they feel it as a personal attack, find ways to appeal to them in other ways, and to show respect to them in the process. The last point, and this is something that is not easy to do. It's easy to talk about it, not so easy to do it. When discussing with someone, it's usually better to leave them some dignity, not to just go in for a full frontal attack on everything. You're wrong about everything. You're morally corrupt. But to say, yes, I understand that point. Yes, I think that has some value. I see that. But I think there's this other argument that's stronger or that has countervailing force, and leave them with some dignity. To think, well, let's think about this. We can talk about this again at another occasion. I'll think about what you said. Why don't you think about what we talked about? We'll talk about it later. And ultimately, the best kind of victory, if you will, is when you hear that person 6 months or 5 years later repeating your arguments to another person. Ultimately, that's much more satisfying than having crushed and destroyed a person in a confrontation. But instead, to have a conversation, help them to see things in a different way, to see the importance of individual human beings, to see the possibilities of order emerging without a boss or a dictator, spontaneously through social cooperation. And when you hear that argument repeated by that other person, it really, really feels good because you have not defeated a person, you have won a friend for liberty.
Absolutely. This is a great ancient wisdom going back to Sun Tzu, where he says something to the extent of create a golden bridge for your opponent to retreat across. So, in other words, don't say you're an evil statist who believes in slavery and wants to murder me for not chipping in for wars based on lies. It's much more of a Socratic approach of asking people what they think about certain things and more planting a seed rather than chopping down, much like an axe. There are a lot of divides that you talk about in the article where we certainly have false divides on income, divides on age, people divided by race, people divided by nationality, as if, all the French people hated all the German people, at some point in history, when it's really a few rulers warring against each other with civilians. What are your thoughts on, is there a true divide, for example, coercion versus voluntarism? Are there true divides that we should probably embrace, or is any divisiveness counterproductive?
Well, we always logically categorize various things. There's fish and fowl, there's plants and animals, and so on. That's just part of our sorting out our life on Earth, is making categories and distinctions among things. And I have no problem with doing that. We can certainly make a distinction between people who want to live and let live, and people who want to live and kill. And I think that's an important distinction to make. So I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. Those typically do not correspond very closely to the other issues that you raise, skin color and things of that sort. But yes, I think that is an important moral distinction. When we talk about the ideas that people hold in contrast to their behavior, one of the things that we find is quite often their ideas don't correspond very much to their behavior. So to take a very simple example, and I think this is one fruitful way to advance the idea of libertarianism, is to talk about how people live their own lives. If they want something, they don't usually just smash the window of a store and take it. They go in and they ask, what would you like for it? We call that a price in most commercial transactions. If they find someone attractive and would like to have a relationship with that person, they don't just grab the person by the hair and drag her or him off to satisfy their lust. They engage in courtship. They say, would you like to go out on a date? And they act in such a way, would this be interesting to you as well? When they want someone to do something for them, they don't bludgeon them or point a gun at them. They act as libertarians in their everyday lives. But their theories, their thinking at an abstract level about how society works doesn't correspond to their actual behavior. They think that somehow the state or the government is magical, that it's made up of people who aren't like you and me, that they have these magic powers. And so that if they shoot someone or put them in a cage for having a plant in their house or something like that, that somehow they're authorized to do that, even though they would understand that that individual person isn't. So let's say that they don't think people should smoke marijuana. Take myself as an example. I don't smoke marijuana. It's not part of my life. I tried it many decades ago and I didn't like it. And unlike our former presidents, I did inhale. I decided that's not for me. But I don't think that people should be put in cages or brutalized or subject to violence because they own a plant or because they smoke it for relaxation or medical purposes or pleasure or whatever reason. Most people understand you couldn't just smash down the door of your neighbor's house because they're doing something you don't like. But then they think, well, it's okay for the state to do that. And we should ask, well, who are they? They're just people too. If you don't have that power and that authority, how can they get it? Where does that come from? So my view is that being a libertarian is really applying to broader kinds of social relationships principles that govern our own lives. And they're the basic ones that you teach to small children. Don't hit other people. Don't break or take their stuff. And don't lie to people. Those are really good rules of social interaction. And they work with large groups of people just as they do with small personal interactions.
How do you think the state has really bestowed itself to have such a blatant double standard? I mean, when we see atrocities committed by the state, it's like the first thing people do is, either defend the police, defend the military, remind us that a hard job for some reason justifies initiating violence against peaceful people. How does the state create and perpetuate such a blatant double standard that if any of us did it, we'd be seen as criminal? And like you said earlier, if the state gets its rights from the people and the people don't have the right to tax, regulate, or murder, how can you delegate a right that you don't have? How does such an ideology persist?
It's complicated. Let me start out with a suggestion: be careful about a word like regulate. I don't have a problem with regulation if we understand it in the right way. It comes from to make regular. It doesn't mean what it now has come to mean, which is to intervene arbitrarily, capriciously, and unpredictably in the private affairs of other persons. But the idea of making regular, so in the American Constitution, that Congress shall have the power to regulate trade among the states, it meant to make it regular, not to impose all kinds of crazy restrictions that are arbitrary on persons engaging in trade, but to make them regular. And so what I want is a society that is regulated by the rule of law, not regulated by unaccountable bureaucrats with enforcement powers. And as we see in the American case with administrative agencies, they have the power of investigating, prosecuting, exercising a judicial function, and punishing, all in one group of persons, but rather regulated by the rule of law. But let's go back to the key question, and I think it has to do with language to begin with, and I would recommend reading the works of George Orwell in this regard. His book 1984 is such a great read, and if anyone hasn't read it, it's worth picking up and reading someday. But then also a very fine essay that he wrote on politics in the English language.
All right, Mr. Palmer. I'm so sorry about that. I had a bit of an internet issue here. So we were discussing politics and the English language and 1984 by George Orwell, and how the state uses euphemisms or certain languages in order to persuade people that morality should have a different standard when applied to state agents in certain circumstances. Could you tell us more about the importance of George Orwell's politics and the English language?
I really recommend reading Orwell. I think Orwell was such an insightful person. Doesn't follow I would agree with him on everything, but he was full of deep insights and was authentically opposed to the totalitarian states that he saw in his day. And in this wonderful essay, Politics in the English Language, which I strongly encourage people to get, will help you to become a better writer, among other things, but then a better communicator generally. He takes this example. He says about the use of euphemisms. Consider, for instance, some comfortable English professor defending Russian totalitarianism. He cannot say outright, I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so. Probably, therefore, he will say something like this. While freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement, which boils down to, I believe in killing off your opponents when you get the results that you want. This kind of abusive language is quite common, and Orwell understood that language was a very important tool of those who want to seek power over others. And being able to use language in a precise way, in a clear way, is very, very important. But it also means that we should go through and think about the terms that we use in everyday life. We talked earlier about the nation and the state and so on, and to engage in systematic meditation about what do we mean by those terms? What are we talking about? When we talk about how the United States invaded Iraq, let's ask really what was going on there. Was it that America went to Iraq? No. Some people in the United States made decisions to send some others to invade a territory ruled by a dictator with his own coercive apparatus and kill people. Why did that happen? How did it happen? Those are the questions that individualists ask, and collectivists ultimately can't. They just say, well, America and Iraq, America invaded Iraq. But it's the individualists who can act, who can ask the question, who made those decisions? How did they get the other people to comply with them? Why did they do that? Those are the real questions of political science. In a certain sense, libertarians are better equipped, in my opinion, to grapple morally with the interactions of persons, not to dismiss human lives destroyed as collateral damage and so on, to name it that and then put it aside, but also better equipped as political scientists to understand the world, to understand how things happen, to find who are the active players and why did other people go along with the decisions that they made.
How would you define freedom?
Well, of course, one of the deep questions, freedom is what has been called an essentially contested concept. Very few people say, well, I'm just against freedom. What they say, by freedom, I mean X or Y or Z. So everyone is claiming that they want to have it, but they have a very different conception of what it is. Or as Ronald Dworkin put it, the difference between the concept and the conception of it. And that's true of equality, justice, order, freedom, and so on. These are all essentially contested concepts. So a libertarian approach or a classical liberal approach, I consider those to be coterminous, looks at the ability of a person to act not being subject to the arbitrary power of another. So John Locke, I think, gave a canonical statement in the Second Treatise of Government of what it means to be free, and he distinguished it from license. License means just doing whatever you want to do without regard for the rights or the freedoms of other persons. He says that's license. But freedom, rather, is to be free from the arbitrary will of another. And that couldn't be the case if I were free to do whatever I wanted. It would mean that you would be subject to my arbitrary power. And if you had that same freedom, I would be subject to yours. But rather, to be subject to the same law for all of us. He had a statement that really struck me when I read it years ago, probably for the third time, but sometimes things leap off the page and you see the power of them. He says that law is not there to abolish or eliminate our freedom. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. And I believe that the concept of freedom, as we understand it, is intimately connected to the rule of law. It's something that I understood much more clearly when I worked in communist and post-communist societies. They didn't have rule of law in those societies. And that means that the experience of freedom is fleeting and always subject to its elimination. The rule of law, in my opinion, is intimately connected to the idea of freedom. And then finally, this idea has been articulated at much greater length and with a great depth by Professor Friedrich Hayek, F.A. Hayek, in The Constitution of Liberty and in his works Law, Legislation, and Liberty, and many other writings about freedom, law, and social order.
You and I were speaking about the essay, I Have No Enemies, my final statement, written by Liu Xiaobo. First, please correct me on the pronunciation of the name. Second, what do you think about his ideas on the weakening of the enemy mentality?
Well, Liu Xiaobo, and by the way, I don't speak Chinese also, so an authentic speaker of Chinese would probably cringe at both of us pronouncing his name, but we do our best. I think he was one of the more noble and admirable people to stand up against totalitarianism. He suffered through his life. He was imprisoned many times, he and his wife both. I recommend reading his last statement, which was the letter that upon his sentencing that was to be read to his wife. It's extraordinarily powerful and moving, and I was moved to tears by it, to read the love that he had for his wife and how that gave him strength under these terrible circumstances. But he argued that the enemy mentality, the idea that I have enemies, is poisonous to freedom. And I recommend people go online, Liu, L-I-U, Xiaobo, Xiaobo, as I recall, and find his lecture. He was a Nobel laureate, so it's on the Nobel Nobel Foundation list of Nobel laureates. You can find his speech. And he argues that the people who were imprisoning him were not his enemies. The prosecutor, the judge, the guards, and so on. He said, ultimately, I don't hate you. And I think that was an expression of his freedom. They cannot make him hate them. He remained a free person. And despite the terrible things that they did to him, they were not able to make him hate them. And he did not want to promulgate a mentality of hatred because he knew that that just reinforces authoritarianism or totalitarianism in this case. Instead, to be in love with the freedom of every person. And I think that emotionally and spiritually, it's a much more healthy approach for true liberals or libertarians not to have enemy mentality, not to say you're the enemy. Now, we can look at the United States and elsewhere where we are now bombarded by the enemy mentality view. The president talks about people are the enemies of the people. They're the enemies of the people. They're my enemies. We have to crush and destroy them. And that road leads to a very dark and terrible place. And it is not one that is characterized by individual liberty. Much better to have a society in which, despite our differences, we try to live together and to do so in peaceful coexistence.
Oh, yes. There is another part of the essay where he talks about freedom of speech, saying, freedom of expression is the foundation of human rights, the source of humanity, and the mother of truth. What do you think is the real importance of freedom of speech when, I certainly see a lack of understanding for other ideas? I constantly, am hearing the right say, well, the left are just a bunch of people who don't want to work for anything, and the right is a bunch of bigots who are dupes of the Koch brothers. So what do you think about the importance of freedom of speech?
Well, I do think it's very important. I don't think that it's the only or the foundational. I'm looking up for something I want to quote to you very quickly. It's not the only freedom. That's a kind of a conceit that we would find among writers. So not surprisingly, that it is the most important or the foundational. I think it is, of course, deeply, deeply important. Let me just find this writer, Vasily Grossman. Grossman had been a Soviet writer, and in his book, Forever Flowing, which was a very powerful criticism of communism, was not published in his lifetime, he said that he came to understand that freedom wasn't only the freedom to speak or the freedom to write, it was that, but also it was the freedom to bake cakes and sell them to other people. It was the freedom to be able to sow grain and reap what you have sown. It wasn't only the freedom of the intellectual like himself, he was a writer, but it was the freedom of everybody, that was the life of the human being. Grossman, I think, is also, like Liu Xiaobo, a very important and underappreciated contributor to the libertarian idea and the libertarian mentality. His books, Life and Fate and Forever Flowing, which Life and Fate is a big, big Russian novel, so quite imposing. Forever Flowing is much shorter. We're full of insights about libertarianism, and by a man who never lived in a free society, never lived in a free society. He died in the Soviet Union, but he understood very deeply the nature of freedom and what it was that he yearned for. So I think Grossman is an important figure. And then Liu Xiaobo, also coming from China, has much to teach us about the promotion of liberty and the understanding of what freedom is.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate both the article you wrote and that one you sent me by Lou Xiaobo. I want to give people who might not be familiar with libertarianism a brief introduction. So, just a response to some of the top 5 things, if we could sort of do a lightning round. If I'm someone who just cares about poverty and the well being of others, why should I consider libertarianism?
Well, one way to look at it is to look at data on poverty rates around the world. And Angus Maddison, a very important economic statistician from the United Kingdom, began this compilation. He looked at per capita income around the world for the last 2,000 years, roughly. And what he found was it was quite flat for a very long time until the period of the liberal reforms or the libertarian movements. So until the really very late 18th or early 19th century, and then it begins to take off. And in a short period of time, human life is transformed and people leave behind crushing, brutal poverty. If you read books about the ancient world, about Greece and Rome, or about the Middle Ages, we get this picture of how the ruling elites lived. They were the few people who had the education to be able to read and write, wrote books about their lives. The vast majority of people lived lives of constant toil and suffering. People died of old age in their mid-30s. Life was hard and miserable for the vast majority of people. People began to escape poverty when libertarian institutions began to become entrenched. The rule of law, limited government, freedom of trade, freedom of speech, the right to propose new ideas and not be burned alive for heresy, for having these terrible, wicked new ideas. It has liberated humanity. And this process continues. Just since 2000 until 2020, the global poverty rate of people living in dire poverty has fallen by 50%. So we are seeing that freedom of trade, freedom of markets is the greatest device ever in the history of humanity for eliminating poverty. I wrote a chapter for a book that was published by Cambridge University Press on morality and poverty. And I remember one of the questions we were asked was, what's the cause of poverty? And I was the only one of all the contributors who said, that's not a very interesting question. Poverty is the natural state of humanity. The question should be, what causes wealth? What causes wealth? And that's the question we should focus on. And I think libertarians focusing on the freedom of enterprise, value creation, and trade have by far the best answer to what is the cause of wealth.
What is the moral case for libertarianism?
Well, I'm not sure there's just one moral case because there are a multitude of different moral traditions and religious, theological, ethical traditions around the world. So I would hesitate to argue that there's just one moral case. In fact, I think it's a mistake to reduce something to just one argument, as if you couldn't have more than one argument for doing something. I eat certain kinds of food because they're tasty and they're healthy. I don't have to choose one or the other. So there are actually tasty, healthy things in the world. Those are two reasons to eat that thing. I don't have to pick one or the other. But I think fundamentally they all rest at some level on the importance of the human being, on the importance of the human being. That when we hit someone on the head, when we use violence against another person, we are doing something that destroys or harms another moral agent. People are not just things in the world, like stones that can be moved around. And then the other point is the equality of human beings. Doesn't mean we're all equally good musicians or equally good mathematicians or other things of that sort. But we do, each one of us, have the fundamental dignity of being a moral agent, someone who can make choices about my own life as you can about yours. And when I use force to hit you over the head to make you do what I want, I'm doing some kind of violence to your very status and my relationship to you as another moral agent. I think persuasion is something that human beings can engage in, and it is one of the distinguishing features of human beings. and we should rely on persuasion rather than force or violence to interact with other people. And then many other things fall from that. I'll mention very quickly a triumvirate of ideas that are reinforcing. One, I mentioned the idea of the human being as morally significant and having rights, that people should be free. The second point, however, those who oppose this always said, well, that'll lead to chaos. If you do what you have a right to do and I do what I have a right to do, the result will be chaos. So the second reinforcing pillar is the idea of spontaneous order, that order can emerge spontaneously without a boss or a dictator or someone pointing a gun at you. Language is a spontaneous order. Moral behavior is quite often a spontaneous order. Rules and principles emerge. The common law emerges spontaneously. And the market economy, the one that has been better studied, but is only one example among many of orders that emerge that allow us to predict the behavior of other people, to coordinate with them voluntarily without someone designing it. And then finally, that only happens as spontaneous order when there are certain conditions that have been established. Fundamentally, the rights of persons are well defined and legally secure, and there's access to some kind of adjudication or judicial procedure for when people have conflicts. Sometimes misunderstandings about rights, we think about contract law, but there are many, many others as well. And for that, you need the rule of law to help us to define our rights and know what is yours and what is mine, to make sure that they are legally secure against invasion, and then to facilitate voluntary exchange in forms of coordination and cooperation. So those three pillars reinforce each other. They're like the legs of a tripod. Any one alone would be inadequate to make the case for libertarianism. But when combined, you have a stable platform that produces what I think is not only a just society, but good societies as well.
I know we said we'd talk for about an hour. Do you have time for two more questions?
Sure.
When people look at the market economy, they might see something very unstable and out of their control. So they will advocate for the state. You corrected me earlier on the use of regulation. They will argue that a group of people has the right to coercively stop people from engaging in certain risky behaviors under the guise of what we call regulation. This could come under the guise of protecting consumers from unsafe products that could cut their hand off, or unsafe working conditions. Does the idea of state regulation justify an argument against libertarianism?
Well, I think that the question is, what is it that is being regulated and how? Rules that are predictable might sometimes lead to outcomes that you and I don't like because there's risk in the world, right? That sometimes happens. The attempt to eliminate and make risk zero, which is I think where you're going with that, is simply impossible. It's like trying to squeeze a balloon. What we want to have, instead of giving some people a special power behavior. And those principles that people are liable for the acts that they undertake are more likely to generate an orderly and beneficial social order. So think about things like regulation of food. You're probably too young to remember, but years ago, the United States Department of Agriculture would produce these food pyramids about what you should be eating. Lots and lots of white processed bread and so on, all the way up to the pinnacle. And they had this very clear guidance. Well, as it turns out, that was really, really bad dietary advice. And the idea that fat makes you fat, which was the theory behind that, so we should always avoid fats, well, that's actually not very good advice. We know that now. But for years, it was drilled into people that the government knows what a good diet is. Turns out it was quite bad dietary advice. I'm not a dietitian, and I don't have expert advice for people, but I'm aware that was really, really bad advice that we were given for a long time. But everyone believed it because it's the United States Department of Agriculture. How can they be wrong about these things? If you look at the Food and Drug Administration, in the attempt to protect us from one kind of risk, they impose all sorts of others on us. And we've seen this over and over again, type 1 and type 2 errors. In order to avoid one, they end up with a lot more of the others. To take a very simple example that was prominent years ago, the FDA regulates medical devices as well as drugs. And it was illegal for a doctor to prescribe or to deliver to a woman a breast self-examination device, which was a simple disc that had silicone in it, and she could rub it over her body when she was bathing or after a shower, and it made her fingertips much more sensitive to be able to detect a lump. And that's very important for women's health, to be able to identify breast cancer early. They can have an early intervention, not have to go all the way to a mastectomy or even death if it's undetected. But that was illegal because the FDA had to determine its medical efficacy after years and years of testing. You could get it any place in the world except the United States. And in the US, doctors would have been punished for having provided that. In the attempt to avoid one kind of error, they ended up killing substantial numbers of people who died from breast cancer or suffered extreme forms of surgery to save their lives because they did not detect it early on. I would rather have a system in which people are liable. There is proper liability for adulterated products or non-functioning devices and so on, and let people have the freedom to try and choose for themselves rather than having the FDA banning medications or medical devices, because those have costs as well, and quite often much higher risks than the risks that they are ostensibly avoiding.
Oh, yes. And, it's like they never apply that to the state themselves. I mean, the state is a totally risky organization, often involved in mass murder and arbitrarily enforcing laws, putting people in jail for victimless crimes, ruining families. So the idea that I'm against risk, therefore the state should have more power is a total non sequitur. I'm curious, my final question is, what are some books you recommend to people? I, of course, love your excellent work, Realizing Freedom. You also have a great book, After the Welfare State. You have another one, Why Liberty, or these collections of essays. What are some books that are not yours that you would recommend other people get a hold of?
Well, that depends on one's interests generally. I continue to learn from the books of F.A. Hayek. He's not easy to read. For one thing, he's thinking in German and writing in English, and that makes very complex sentence structures for sometimes complex ideas. But I always learn from him. I remember when I was a young man, I went to a lecture that he gave, and I was so struck by his answer. He was asked a question, and he said, I gather from the form of your question you believe X and Y. And the questioner said yes. And he said something, he was a rather old man at the time when I was very young. He said, I also was of this opinion for about 50 years, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I think it was a fundamental mistake. I thought, that is a serious thinker. He is always thinking. So his works are always provocative. Frederick Bastiat, I think, is always wonderful also. And his books are so clear and so wonderful, anybody can learn from Bastiat. So I highly recommend those. The Law, What is Seen and What is Not Seen, are really powerful statements that persist in value. A book that I read recently, I should have read it earlier, but I enjoyed it tremendously, is William Easterly's book, The Tyranny of Experts. It's a great book if you want to understand what causes wealth, if you want to understand what social and economic development is based on individual rights. This book is a treasure. Very readable, beautifully written. He's a professor at NYU and has long experience as an economist in development areas. So that is one of the recent books. I absolutely loved it, and I'm strongly recommend it.
Excellent. Mr. Palmer, thank you so much for your time. As I said, please check out his excellent book, Realizing Freedom, Libertarian Theory, History, and Practice. Have a good rest of your day, sir. Thank you for joining us on Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone.
So long.